questions that you all submitted ahead of time. And then in the second half, we'll invite you to ask questions in real time by just using the chat box. So those of you who are a little bit unfamiliar with Zoom, at the bottom of the page, it says participants and then chat. You would just click onto the chat and go ahead and enter your questions. And I will read your questions and Grace will answer. Those of you who, if I read your question and Grace answers, please feel free to unmute to follow up or any commentary that you have. Yep, if you have questions you'd like to ask after we have completed the, sorry about that, yep, the chat box. So I want to remind everyone we are audio taping this event, so folks who are not able to participate can listen to the recordings on our website at a different time or convenient time. So if you are in a space with a lot of background, please go ahead and mute your mic. If everyone can mute their mic right now, that would be a lot better, so we're not going to hear interference. You can unmute yourself by clicking the same button when you want to join the discussion. All right. If we see that there's too much background noise coming from your end, Soraya, our project coordinator, will go ahead and mute you. Sometimes people have difficulty. All right, so to make sure the session runs smoothly, we've got a couple of ground rules. First, only one person talks at a time. So that's either going to be Grace or it's going to be the person who had asked the question. If the discussion around a specific question is going beyond a reasonable time, I'll just kind of give a warning signal. So the person has about 10 seconds to wrap up because I want to make sure that we get to everyone's questions. And three, let's just be kind and respectful to one another, no interrupting. Jerry and I are here to stay late if you have any questions about more clinical questions about diabetes or mental health. So I'd like to introduce our guest expert. Grace Tan obtained her degree in dietetics at the University of British Columbia and is a registered dietitian working for Fraser Health Authority. Her primary area of work is specialized in diabetes and pregnancy care, where she supports women with pre-existing diabetes or gestational diabetes achieve good nutrition and optimal blood sugar control throughout their pregnancy. Outside of diabetes, Grace also has experience in a variety of other areas, from general nutrition, counseling to nutrition care for acutely ill patients in the hospital. And she is also a member of our T1D Trifecta Piazza team. So when you submit questions about diet, she is one of the people who answers. So let's go ahead and start. Oh, you know what? I'm going to have Grace. Do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Grace. Thanks for having me here tonight. Hopefully everyone can hear me pretty clearly. So, I mean, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I'm part of the type 1 diabetes trifecta team. I think Trisha summarized it pretty well. So,
okay, great.
Happy to hear it. Yeah.
Right into the questions. Question one, what are your feelings on eating meat versus vegetarianism as someone with diabetes?
I think my response to this is true whether you have diabetes or whether you don't. There are a lot of reasons to eat less meat in general. And the benefits of eating less meat and leaning towards sort of more plant-based proteins would be the added fiber that comes from things like lentils and beans, as well as the healthy fats that come from things like nuts. In general, that for everybody is a healthier way to go. I would say you don't have to eliminate meat entirely. Nobody has to prescribe to any specific diet where you just are a vegetarian or you're a vegan or you eat meat. If you reduce the amount of meat that you eat, that typically makes an impact on health, but that also has good impacts for the environment too. So whatever your motivation is, for some people that might be around the environmental impacts of eating less meat, because we know that animal agriculture uses a lot of resources. It takes up a lot of land to grow feed for animals, and it uses a lot of water. That being said, if you do eat meat, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. That doesn't mean you're in poor health. I myself am an omnivore. So you could be eating meat sometimes for, cultural reasons. I'm of a Chinese background, and there's a lot of meat in a lot of dishes in Chinese food. So it doesn't mean that if you sometimes eat meat that you're in poor health either. but I would encourage you in terms of choosing a variety of foods that still applies. And maybe if you do eat meat on a really regular basis, maybe for all of your meals, all days of the week, I would encourage you to try maybe doing like a meatless Monday situation where you choose one day where you make that switch and try a plant-based protein instead. And again, that comes down to, there are some research studies out there too that support that vegetarian-based diets can have improved impacts on things like insulin sensitivity, but also especially for heart disease, because we know that eating whole grains, eating healthy fats that are in nuts and seeds, and even in things like soy protein here and there, those can have protective effects for cardiovascular disease. So my feelings with meat and vegetarianism, the same, if you have diabetes, if you don't have diabetes. A little bit of meat is not a bad thing. Keeping away from the more processed ones would generally be a good idea. So, your bacons and your deli meats, those are really high in sodium. Those are highly processed. But if you eat some chicken, if you eat fish, if you eat eggs, those can all be really nutritious foods still too. So overall, a balance is still important. Does that? Yeah.
Great. The person who asked that question, would you like to comment or follow up? Okay, great. I'll go on to the next question. There seems to be a big discrepancy in two predominant ways of managing type 1. Carb counting, the traditional Western medicine approach, versus whole foods, low fat, plant-based approach. Could you provide your take on the main differences and why there seems to be such a schism between the two approaches?
So for this one, I hope whoever asked the question is actually live here, because I might need a little bit of clarification. So with the sort of traditional Western medicine approach of carb counting, my understanding of this is something that I would recommend in my own practice, which would be not necessarily eating a restrictive carb diet or low carb, but it's more like focused on meal balance and moderate carbohydrate intake. I would consider that as sort of a Western traditional approach, because then the opposite to this coin, the whole foods, low fat, plant-based approach, this is based off of for those of you who don't know, it's a very, very high carbohydrate diet that's based off of mostly fruit, some vegetables, starchy vegetables, lentils, and beans. So it's plant-based, but it's a very, very high carbohydrate, very low in fat. So my understanding from this is that I think maybe in the traditional Western medicine approach, it comes across as that carbs are demonized or that they're bad. So then a lot of people feel as though they need to really restrict them. But in reality, we never really tell you to stop eating the carbs. And we'll get into this a lot regarding things like the ketogenic diet later. But we still encourage some carbohydrate intake, and we always do encourage the higher quality carbs, things like slower burning ones such as whole grains or yams, are foods that are still considered healthy choices. Counting your carbs is important in that manner. And I think when you eat something that's a really high carb diet, the questions here that's probably running through a lot of people's minds is when you're counting for a meal that's so high carb, I think sometimes the fear is that when your meal is really high carb, now you have to give a lot of insulin for it. And that comes hand in hand with probably feeling like carbs are more demonized and not wanting to eat as many. Because the more carbs we eat, the more carbs we need to count for. And that can lead to higher errors with the carb counting. And a lot of that comes with some fear that you've maybe given too much insulin and that you're going to have a low. So I think when it comes to the Western approach, the moderate carbohydrate intake, like what's classically recommended is somewhere between 30 to 60 grams of carbs per meal. And that might look different for everybody. Some people would say maybe 60 grams is way more than they want to eat because they get really high highs and then they plummet and their blood sugars go low. But some people might find that this is a really good place for them. So when it comes to that high carb approach, I didn't know that much about this. I went down the rabbit hole with the internet, trying to find what's really behind this. So it sounds like it comes from these two men that have a program called Mastering Diabetes, and they come out of California. And the people that follow these diets eat anywhere between, it sounds like, 300 to 700 grams of carbohydrates per day. And so, and we'll get into this as well, but one of the big factors that they say that you should support this type of diet is because of the insulin sensitivity benefits that it provides, which a lot of you might think sounds crazy when you eat this many carbs, how it can possibly improve your insulin sensitivity. And I think that comes from this diet actually ends up being a little bit restrictive, in my opinion, because when you're eating mostly fruit and vegetables for the majority of it, and then maybe some nuts here and there, because remember, this is a low fat diet as well, you're actually cutting out a lot of foods that you could possibly eat. So in my opinion, this ends up being a very restrictive diet. It does also sound like a very active lifestyle is the key to the success here. And a lot of the insulin sensitivity might come from the associated weight loss that you might experience, which also perhaps would seem counterintuitive if you're eating a ton of carbs. But a lot of these carbs come from things like fruit, and then you eat a lot of vegetables. And so overall, it's a really high fiber diet, which may mean that overall you're not actually eating that many calories in the day. So the overall caloric intake may actually be lower, which is what might fuel some of the weight loss that follows there. So those are the main differences. I would say the Western approach is much more of like a moderate carbohydrate, encouraging balance, which some people might interpret as eating more meat. And then there's the plant-based high carb approach, which is plant-based foods and a lot of fruit and some starch, as well as lentils and beans. And the schism that happens between the two, that's most likely because they're just really, really different approaches. One is on the assumption, obviously, that carbs cause your blood sugars to go up. And so by moderating the amount that you eat, you wouldn't have such high blood sugar excursions. Whereas the other one, sorry, I lost my train of thought. What are we answering here? Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. The
schism. So you're saying, what are the advantages of the Western approach, and then you were just about to talk about the advantages of the plant-based.
Yeah, I think from the perspective of the plant-based approach, it sounds like the Western approach promotes things like eating lots of meat and eating things like high fat, like butters and whipping creams and such. But if we take a look at sort of the healthy plate model that is often encouraged and modeled in our education, it's still half the plate is encouraged to be your vegetables. About a quarter of that plate is your carbohydrates, and another quarter of that plate would be your protein. And that protein doesn't necessarily have to be a meat source either. So I wouldn't say when you come down to it that it's tremendously different aside from the huge carbohydrate intake in the plant-based one. But I think that's where they when they talk about the traditional approach, they say, oh, it's got a lot of plant-based protein, animal protein, a lot of fat in it. So I would have difficulty promoting the plant-based high carb diet because of the restrictive nature that I mentioned. So in the long term, I think it would be really difficult to follow this type of diet where it's extremely low in fat. So in this diet, they encourage it to be less than 15% of your daily intake. It comes from fat. And from the acceptable macronutrient distribution range that our studies sort of support, it's anywhere between usually, I believe 10 to 20 or 10 to 30% fat. So, sorry, not 10, 20 to 30% fat. So less than 15% is significantly lower. And fat has important roles in our body in terms of hormone regulation. It's also really important for fat-soluble vitamin absorption. So my concerns over a diet like this is that in the long term, it may not be beneficial because it would be really difficult to adhere to. But there are people online that have been doing this for a long time. So again, with any type of diet, something that you're able to follow in the long term would be the best solution for you. If it's something that you might find difficult to adhere to for sort of the rest of your life, then it may not be something that is most beneficial.
Okay, great. The person who asked that question, I
Mm-hmm.
invite you to unmute and follow up or make a comment.
Yeah, that'd be me. I think the answer was very clear. Thank you very much. I guess the only question I have that seems a little confusing still to me is how somebody, let's say with a more Western approach, would have such spikes with blood sugar from eating just minimal amounts. Let's say they have 30 grams of carbs in one meal. And then if they're going to have the other approach where they're eating 700 grams a day, how could you explain or account for the like lower insulin need? Is it just sensitivity from eating such a fibrous diet, fibrous carbohydrates?
Well, I tried to figure this out, and it could happen from, it could be the fiber intake, though equivalently, if you were eating the traditional diet, you could also have an equal amount of fiber in your meal. If you ate lots of vegetables in that meal, you ate the 30 grams of carbs, right, and had your protein, you could actually have equivalent amounts of fiber. I tried to find out if the adaptation in terms of the increased sensitivity, if that came immediately or if that happened in the long run. We know that when it comes to insulin sensitivity, there are multiple factors that are involved. And it usually comes from the visceral fat that is sort of in the abdominal region, right? So the visceral fat is the type of fat that coats your organs, specifically things like your liver. And that can impact your fasting blood sugar, but it can also impact things like your insulin sensitivity. So I don't know if following that sort of plant-based approach, because of its more restrictive nature, they ended up losing weight, and that contributed to a lot of the insulin sensitivity. So if you lose weight in another method, would you have the same improvements in the insulin sensitivity? Maybe. The other thing, though, is that sometimes there have been some studies, too, that suggest that really high-fat meals can impair your insulin sensitivity acutely. So if you're eating a higher-fat meal, perhaps over the next few hours, if you controlled for the carbohydrate content and the protein, you may actually find that if the meals were the same, but one was really low-fat and one was really high-fat, over a certain amount of hours, you will see that blood sugar rise later with a higher-fat meal. You may also need more insulin for that meal, even if you controlled for the carbs. So it could have to do with the fact that there's hardly any fat in this diet, but I wasn't able to find anything on their actual website, nor from any of the anecdotal posts that I found on this sort of forum where people were discussing their experiences when they started to notice it. But they do suggest when people start with like one meal at a time, and to start with the sort of more lower glycemic fruits, and then eventually progress to some starches. And I don't know if that has to do with, why that is, but I think some of the insulin carb ratios that they were suggesting that some people use were like 1:30 or like 1:60, which seems crazy. So yeah, that there's a community out there, and if that works for them, by all means. But my concern in the long run would essentially be the fat intake and the lack of essential fatty acids that are in that diet as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, very good answer. Thank you. Yeah, it does seem pretty interesting that there's such a big difference. But I mean, if one is able to adhere to something that seems overall very healthy, I mean, it seems worth trying,
Yeah, if it's something, I would say if you were to try and adapt to a diet that was similar to that, like plant-based by all means, I think can be healthy. I would encourage you to find some support through a dietitian in terms of make sure you have all the micronutrient needs, so your vitamins and minerals, so you're not missing things.
Yeah, like
Fruits
B12
and vegetables.
Big one.
Exactly, yeah. In plant-based eating, things like B12, it's really common to be deficient in. And also making sure you're getting a variety of foods, because the protein sources that are in vegetarian protein, if you're not eating a variety of like beans and lentils and even things like whole grains like quinoa, then you may end up missing certain amino acids. So if you so if you want to try a diet like that that's plant-based, there are certainly health benefits to it, but I would try and move away from such a restrictive amount of fat in it, because and I think there's a question later regarding essential fatty acids or different fats, but alluding to it, there are healthy fats that are important in the diet. So trying to make sure you're getting those still. So maybe not less than 15%, but at least trying to get the minimum like 20%.
Okay, perfect.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. And you're right. There is a question about fats.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain the different types of fat? How does our intake of fats affect us as type 1s? And how much is an acceptable daily amount of fat as someone who has type 1?
So, so before I dive into this and I start mentioning specific foods and the fats that they contain, it's important to remember that all foods, like the fat-containing foods, will contain a mix of different fatty acids in them. So, for example, the first fat that I'll talk about is saturated fats. Now, saturated fats are solid at room temperature. And this is usually in the fat that comes from animals and things like butter. As well as coconut oil. So they're solid at room temperature. And even all of those fats that I just mentioned will have some combination of saturated, unsaturated, polyunsaturated, but the majority of them, for example, butter, the majority of it would be saturated fat. So that saturated fats are usually kind of under this category of like the bad fats. So also under the category of the bad fats would be like the trans fats. Now, I would say trans fats are actually going to be a type of fat that I would discourage eating a lot of. I think saturated fat might get a bad rep in some areas, but trans fats come from a lot of fast foods, processed baked goods, and a lot of hydrogenated oils. So I would say that trans fats are ones that I would avoid generally, just because they do have pretty strong links to negative cardiovascular impacts. In terms of saturated fat, they're for a long time has been quite demonized for their impacts on things like your blood cholesterol. And that is true, it seems, for the saturated fat that comes from animals. So the saturated fat that comes from animals, there is, and especially the processed animal fat, seems to still have the research behind it that links it to negative cardiovascular events. But more emerging ones, such as coconut oil, it seems as though doesn't necessarily have the same impacts. Same thing with dairy, actually. Now, this is a little bit newer and it doesn't really seem fully conclusive, but some newer research is suggesting that perhaps maybe coconut oil and things like that comes in dairy, even though it is saturated, it may not have the same impact as something like butter or like the fat that comes off of a beefsteak. And so then we move into the good fats. So under the good fats, the first one would be the monounsaturated fatty acids. So the monounsaturated fatty acids, these include like olive oil, avocado, some nuts. So that's sort of the most common ones that I'll mention. These also do have protective effects for our heart. And then the other type that I'll mention as well are the polyunsaturated fatty acids. And so there's a whole umbrella for the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So the first one would be like your omega-3s. And a lot of people hear lots of things about omega-3 fatty acids. They come in mostly fatty fish. And it's not all fatty fish. So it would be salmon, herring, trout, and sardines, and mackerel. So those are the most common ones where you're going to find good sources of omega-3 fatty acids. And omega-3s are essential fats. So what that means is in our bodies, we don't actually make our own omega-3s. So you do have to consume some to actually get them in your body. And they're really important for things like immune function and cognitive and brain development. So having omega-3 fatty acids in your diet is fairly important. And then going back to the plant-based diet. So there are plant-based foods that will contain omega-3 fatty acids in them. The three varieties of omega-3 fats that I'll name are ALA, DHA, and EPA. So you might have heard DHA and EPA most commonly in a lot of supplements. Now, ALA is the one that's in plant-based foods. So the problem with consuming ALA is that it needs to actually be converted into the active form, which is the DHA and the EPA. The problem with the conversion is that it's actually really, really inefficient. So that means you would need to eat a lot of those plant-based sources to actually get the equivalent from eating something like salmon. So what are those plant-based sources? They would be things like walnuts, chia seeds, hemp hearts, and those are good sources of healthy omega-3 fats. They just may not be enough to actually get the amount that you need. So if you are eating a plant-based diet, you may want to consider actually supplementing an omega-3 fatty acid, just because it's unlikely to come much from your diet. If you don't eat a lot of fish, there are also eggs out there that are fortified with omega-3s, so that may also be a good avenue to go as well. And then we have omega-6. So this is also called linoleic acid. It's also an essential fatty acid, and this one comes from things like tofu, seeds, nuts, soy, and vegetable oil. Now, because this comes from a lot of things like vegetable oils and soy, like soybean oil, it actually is really easy to find in the Western diet. So for the majority of us, we don't struggle to actually get enough omega-6 fatty acids in the diet. So when you're thinking about trying to improve the fats that you're eating, that is why omega-3 is pushed so heavily, because omega-6 for the majority of us is not difficult to get. And omega-6 in high amounts has been suggested to be pro-inflammatory, whereas omega-3s are suggested to be anti-inflammatory. So that's another reason why people really encourage the higher intake. Something that's also important to note is the ratio. So nutrition advice is always given as sort of like a blanket statement, like eat more fatty fish and you'll be good. But because it's the ratio that's actually really important, it entails substituting something for another. So just because you eat more fish doesn't necessarily mean that you're improving your risk. It means trying to substitute something that may contain higher amounts of those omega-6 fats for something that contains more of the omega-3s. In terms of someone with diabetes, so the type of fat, as I've kind of mentioned throughout here, the type of fat that you eat has impacts on your cardiovascular disease risk, which we know is something that we need to be aware of with diabetes. So, like I've said, leaning more towards the polyunsaturated and the monounsaturated fatty acids are definitely the way to go. Those are the healthy fats that will help support your nutrition and help have protective effects for your heart. The amount of fat that you eat is really difficult to quantify. And the reason is because a lot of the guidelines will tell you to be sort of moderate with your fat, like 2 to 3 tablespoons of added fat a day at the most. But this will really vary, especially for those of you out there who may be eating a lower carb lifestyle. You might find that you need to be eating more fat to remain satisfied, and that's not uncommon. A lot of this advice that comes from sort of from like diabetes associations is under the assumption that you're eating what is a typical carbohydrate intake. So if you're also adding a high fat intake on top of a moderately higher carbohydrate intake, you are fairly likely to gain more weight. And I think a lot of that advice about being cautious about fat might be related to just being cautious about adding weight if you're also eating like a ton of carbs as well. But if you're following a fairly low carb diet, you may actually need to eat more fat to compensate, so you're not always hungry. Yeah.
Great. Next question. With respect to the keto diet, is it dangerous for a type 1 to produce ketones that result from the body getting energy from fat and muscle rather than a lack on insulin?
Okay, so going into the keto diet is always so contentious, even without type 1 diabetes. So I'll express my opinions first like I did earlier with really restrictive diets, and the keto diet does fall under that. If you don't know what the keto diet is, I don't know how you don't at this point, but it's defined by having a carbohydrate intake of about 20 grams per day or less. Some people will say it's 30, 40, maybe even up to 50. But for the majority of people who are starting the keto diet or to actually get into ketosis, it is around the sort of 20 grams a day or less mark. The diet for its low carb intake is usually compensated by a moderate protein and a high fat intake. And a lot of the negative attitudes towards this diet usually are revolving around, well, the fats that you're replacing with. This diet encourages a lot of animal protein and ends up encouraging a lot of fat that might come from animal sources. So that is one of the reasons why people are concerned, especially when it comes to something like the cholesterol or the lipid profile. And then the other concern is when you're cutting out so many different foods in your diet, you may be missing a lot of different nutrients. And then, of course, then the other concern comes from the restriction factor and whether or not that is a long-term benefit that you can enjoy. Because not eating carbohydrates is really, really difficult. And there are a lot of foods that can contribute to extra carbs in your diet that aren't even really considered carbs that will put you over that 20-gram limit. So in terms of the dangers for type 1, you guys have this extra layer of the danger because of the risk of diabetic ketoacidosis. So when you're producing ketones in nutritional ketosis, and it depends on the method that you're using to test, but I would recommend, like, when it comes to testing ketones, you probably do want to test urine ketones to start, but later on, most certainly blood ketones. And what's considered in nutritional ketosis could be anywhere between like 0.5 to 1.6 in blood ketones. I couldn't tell you what the exact number is where you would be too high and you should consider medical attention, but I would certainly say anything like in the 1.6 to 3 range. Like over 3, you're probably going actually into DKA, but anything in like 1.6 to 3, you might be putting yourself at a higher risk for DKA at that point. So is it dangerous to produce ketones from fat and muscle rather than lack of insulin? DKA is like precipitated in there are multiple different factors. So usually it's a high blood sugar and the lack of insulin. So if you're following a keto diet, you will notice your basal insulin needs will decrease. And if that goes to a point where it gets very, very low, it might become easier to sort of tip you into DKA because you're already producing some ketones. So it wouldn't be very difficult to actually just end up producing a little bit more to the point where it becomes acidotic in your blood. So DKA is defined as, I mean, it varies, but it could be like blood sugar above 14. I think pH is less than 7.3 or so. And then the bicarb level would also be fairly low. And so that gives your blood an acidic environment, which is very, very dangerous for you. So the risks can be obviously higher because you guys are at higher risk for DKA. I would say if it's something that you're really, really passionate about trying, I don't know where you're starting out from, but it might be a good idea to start gently lowering your carbohydrate intake if that shows any benefit to you. Because from my understanding, and you can correct me if you're out there, is that the desire to go on the keto diet for people with diabetes, specifically type 1, is the lower variability in the glucose readings. For people with type 2 or the general population, it seems like weight loss is the driving factor. But for a lot of you guys, it sounds like the interest is just having that lower carbohydrate intake reduces the risks of those like higher blood sugar excursions. So I would say, of course, speak to your doctor and your medical team about it. And starting gently, definitely don't go all the way down to like less than 50 right off the bat, but maybe gently going down and seeing if you can achieve those blood sugar results without necessarily putting yourself at a higher risk for something like DKA.
Great. Anne, if Anne's there, do you want to unmute and follow up or make a comment? Any remarks?
Hey, thanks for that.
Hi.
Hi. Do I want to, I guess my question is, what makes the acidity imbalance in the body dangerous? And is there like is there an amount of insulin you need to be taking to stave that off?
So the acidity comes from the ketones themselves, because the ketones are acidic in nature. So the more ketones that build up in the blood, the more that you're going to be pushing your blood balance into that acidic end. I couldn't tell you if there is a basal insulin rate that you need, because I'm sure that's extremely individualized to you. Probably has to do with your insulin sensitivity as well and what that looks like. I can share, and this is by no means, I don't promote any real specific diet, because nothing that's extremely restrictive, but I do have a colleague, dietitian who I spoke to, who is currently following somewhat of a keto diet, and she obviously does notice that her basal rates decrease. She says that her insulin sensitivity factor tends to go lower, so she is more sensitive, but her carb ratio needs to go tighter, so she needs more insulin for the carbs that she is eating. So I would definitely, if it's something that you would want to pursue anyway, I would absolutely make it known to your team that you want to go lower carb, because they do need to support you and know about what's going on, so that you can also monitor it. But I don't know where you're starting out from, but going gently and seeing where that happy place is for you, where you're not restricting a lot of the foods that you're eating, but able to maintain maybe pretty level blood sugars.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Next question. Why are people with type 1 at greater risk for celiac disease?
So my understanding of this is that it's a similar genetic profile. It's like HLA-DQ2 and DQ8 that they both share. And it's very common amongst type 1s and people who have celiac to have like that gene. So there's a genetic disposition to it. I think the statistic is something like it's like 6% of people who have type 1 diabetes also have celiac. What I'm suspicious of is that there's a higher population of you guys that actually are asymptomatic of it, so you're not actually noticing that you may have celiac because you don't feel it. But the actual diagnosed number is about 6% or so of people who have type 1 who also have celiac. So it comes from a similar genetic profile that it would share, because they're both autoimmune conditions.
Okay. Whoever asked that question, I'd invite you to unmute and make any remarks. Okay, great. Next question. Why is it recommended to have a maximum of 60 grams of carbs per meal?
I'm not really sure if this recommendation just comes from general, the nutrition advice that comes from diabetes centers. It's always, they always say 30 to 60 grams of carbs per meal. This is not a real rule where you can't eat more than 60 grams of carbs per meal. Like, of course, you probably have and did at some point. It's not a real rule, but the reason why it's there, I think, is to provide some guidance for people, especially from that meal balance perspective. So if you're eating some carbohydrates, it's so that your whole plate is not carbohydrates, essentially. So you're still making room for the vegetables in your plate, and you're still making room for the protein that's there. So it's definitely not a real limit, but I think it helps maybe keep in mind other things that could be on your plate that contribute to the meal balance there. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
the person who asked that question, I'd invite you to unmute and respond. Okay, next question. What are some healthy snack suggestions for quarantine snacks in the afternoon?
Healthy snacks or quarantine snacks in the afternoon. Well, I mean, I guess it depends on where you are and what you have access to. Things that are shelf stable are like the classic snacks would be things like nuts, whatever, like whole grain crackers you have on hand. Fruit is usually something that is fairly easy to carry if you have access to a fridge, you can store things like cheese in there. You could store things like hummus in there. You can make those sort of like protein balls, like peanut butter balls. How am I doing? I don't know what else. Need some context here.
Well, so that was just, I think, when you're at home. And the second question was, what about in the office? Like easy to prepare snacks aside from nut butter on crackers? I have a suspicion that you're like nut butter fatigued. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't lean towards things that are like pre-prepared, those kind of bars, but I'm sure you could find something out there that has that's a little bit lower in the sugar, so you don't notice huge sort of afternoon spikes. So yeah, I mean, it's very similar. Like, depends on what you have available in the office, but something like yogurt, hummus, fruit, veggies, all our options.
Okay, great. Next question. Can you speak on autoimmune paleo, the paleo diet, especially to lose weight as a type 1?
So I'm not exactly sure I'm familiar with this autoimmune paleo diet. Could the question asker tell me a little bit more about it, or I can actually also look it up.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi. So I've been a diabetic for 3-4 years, and I was on a call recently, and I guess I heard about it there. I don't really know what it consists of. I know paleo diet is more basically just animal fat, animal protein. But the fact that it's called autoimmune paleo diet, I honestly don't know much about it, but I did hear it in a type 1 call. Just wondering if you knew more, if you could explain. If not, that's okay too.
This is the first time that I've ever heard of it, but I am doing a really quick Google search here for all of us here. Let me see if I can figure out a holistic approach to achieving a healthier and happier life. Okay. I'm not entirely sure. I know. So is there anything else that you know more about? To me, it looks like, just from the pictures here, it looks like lower carb, like paleo typically is, right? So a lower carb, more animal-based diet.
I just wasn't sure why it's called autoimmune paleo diet as opposed to just paleo. It's something new. I believe it was about losing weight specifically. So it was in the same context as keto diet and something else that I don't remember now. But
okay,
we don't know.
Yeah, so it says the paleo autoimmune protocol eliminates certain primal foods that can sometimes trigger inflammation in people with autoimmune disease, such as dairy, eggs, nightshades, nuts, and seeds. So, I mean, in my opinion, some people will say that dairy is quite inflammatory based on, various things. And if dairy doesn't agree with you, like, I by no means think you need to have dairy in your life. I would argue that nuts and seeds are a healthier food, so I don't quite know why they are being demonized in this diet. But if it's something that makes you feel well, if it's something that is successful for you, it does sound like to me like a lower carb diet that does focus a little bit more on the animal protein.
Right.
But if it's something that you can use in the long term, if it's a way of eating that you enjoy, that makes you feel well, I don't think there's any reason necessarily to discount any way of eating if it's something that works well for you. But it's unfortunately something I've not heard of prior to this. I'm sorry.
That's
okay. Great. I'm smiling at the next question. Dave, this is your question, because I know exactly what you mean. What is your strategy for a type 1 for a 2-hour meal? My wife is Asian, so I'm suspecting you're talking about those meals where there's 10 people around the table, a lazy Susan of like,
oh my God.
Dave says, I've been to many. So do you have a strategy for him?
So first of all, are you on injections or are you on a pump?
Dave, do you want to go ahead and answer? Unmute.
There we go. Hi, Grace, and
Hi.
thanks for doing this. I'm on a pump, and my what I usually do is I'll take an injection. You know, fine, I'm gonna have 30 carbs, and then after about 45 minutes, I'll probably do that again. So I'm almost layering, and I'm wondering if that's
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm not. Which pump are you on?
Medtronic.
A Medtronic pump. I don't know which edition, if it's a
No,
newer one or a
I
newer
got
feature.
the loopy one.
670?
Yeah.
Okay. I learned this in a more recent Medtronic event. There is a feature, I think it's called Dual Wave.
It's
I don't know.
called banquet dinner.
Yes. Dual wave, as in there is a second wave of the bolus that will release later on. I think the specifics of this, because it's definitely not something that the pump trainers teach you immediately, just because it gets quite complex and most people wouldn't utilize it, but it is a feature that they mention for any sort of events where you're eating, like grazing, and for a prolonged period of time. They have a dual wave feature that sounds like it releases sort of 2 waves of the bolus at a time. But what you're currently doing, how do you find that works for your blood sugars during those meals?
It never works out, but whatever.
Yeah, it would be really hard to, I mean, I think that's just a given when you eat out too, is that it would be so hard to predict, first and foremost, the amount of carbs that you're actually going to eat, and then the sort of the account for everything else that's involved, and then what else is going to come in the meal. So let alone pre-bolusing for the food. So that's probably the best suggestion I have for you, is that pump that you have actually does have a feature that you could potentially look into that can help release a second wave of that insulin that might help manage that long duration of the meal. And they actually said this might be good if you're like at a party and you're grazing, or, you know, you're at a wedding or something, which again doesn't happen often, which is why they don't teach it to you immediately when they train you.
Well, my question's kind of moot right now, but thank you, Grace.
Yes. Yeah, not for a while for those big dinners.
I just wanted to mention, you know, with traditional Chinese meals are hard because, you know, it's hard to carb count because they're dishes with, you know, integrated with meats and vegetables, potatoes, other things. And so it's really hard to get that what portion size, and carb counting is a little bit more challenging. Okay, so another question from Jennifer from Ontario. Could that be used for grazing? The 2-wave feature you're talking about? I don't eat the 3 meals a day structure. Oh no, we lost her. Yeah.
Oh, hi. Could it be used for grazing? That is, I think potentially it could be. Though I guess it would depend on how spaced out your snacks really are. If you're better off actually just bolusing for your snacks if they're spaced out in that manner, because the feature kind of implies that you really are eating during this whole duration of time. So that might be different than like if you snack and then an hour later you eat another snack, and then an hour later you eat another snack. Like, yes, there's insulin on board, but you are bolusing for the amount that you are eating. So it'd be different if you weren't actually, you know, eating a snack. But if you're actually eating something with carbohydrate in it and you give your insulin for it, it makes sense to do that if it's spaced out. But if it's something like a long meal where you're just constantly eating, then that feature on the pump might be more beneficial, I would think.
Jennifer, did you want to comment?
No, I think that kind of answers it. I don't really, because I don't make meals, I live by myself. So basically I just kind of take bites of stuff all day long. So I'm sort of like, okay, I'm having 15 carbs, maybe, like, you know, here and there. And like, I kind of just leave something sitting on the counter and I just like take a bite.
Yeah, I would be
it's not meals.
No, I hear you. I think I would be cautious of using that feature if it seems like we don't really know when we're going to eat, especially if we just, you know, it might be left behind there and take a few bites and then walk away later, because then you're sort of automating that second wave of the insulin that's going to come. So if in that case, I think you're better off actually just bolusing for what you're eating.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Jennifer, did you attend the Connected in Motion event last week?
Yes. Yeah.
I recognize you. Hi.
Hi.
I recognize your couch. I know that's kind of creepy, but I see it. All right. I have a question from Victoria B. I've done the autoimmune protocol in Paleo. It's super restrictive. The idea is to reduce inflammation. You have to give up coffee. So it sounds like it's something that would be hard to sustain over time.
Thank you for your comment. And thank you for educating us a little bit on what this new diet is. It's not something I'd heard of, but now I know.
Victoria, did you want to, oh, sorry, Victoria, did you want to comment more?
Sure. So it's kind of a fad right now, the autoimmune protocols. There's different books out there, and it's basically a 30-day thing, and then you reintroduce. But like you said, Grace, it's weird. Like, it's basically the kind of usual suspects. So no gluten, no dairy, but then anything that's a seed or a bean, and that's why coffee can't be included, but it's not because of the caffeine, it's actually because it's a pod. And then you also can't have any spices, so like no chilies, no cayenne, no cumin, no like you can only have herbs, you can't have any spices, like no pepper, like literally like black pepper, because it's a nightshade as well. So nightshades are eggplants, red peppers, green peppers. It's very restrictive. I did it because I was having I also am celiac, and I was having a lot of digestive issues, so I was really, really desperate. But it was so, I was so obsessed with, like, it wasn't good for my mental health. And I think that's why we kind of have to think about, and I actually didn't lose any weight on it, because it is a very, like, I became like literally like I felt like a coconut, because all I was eating like full fat cans of coconut, like 2 of them a day, just to get to feel like full, because I was making my like smoothies with, because you can't even have almond milk or anything. So yeah, because it has the guar gum in it, so you have to find the coconut milk without the guar gum in it, which is really hard to find too. So and I love nuts and seeds, so it was just, yeah. And I didn't lose weight, and I think because even the ketogenic, which I also had tried, I gained weight on it as a type 1 diabetic, because we're still taking some insulin, and all of that fat is just sticking to your hips.
Yeah, and so that's something important to remember. There are a lot of different diets out there. A lot of them often confuse me, like this one. And the diets, like the blood type diets, I have no idea where they choose certain foods that come from those diets, but there's not a lot of evidence for those ones. I would argue even for the keto diet, there's a lot more convincing evidence for it. Something to remember too when it comes to the weight loss aspect, if we're just isolating the food and the exercise, really, like, there are other factors in weight loss, right? We know it's stress and sleep and your genetic disposition. Some people are more genetically predisposed to hold on to weight than others. So even if we just isolate the things that you're eating, it's what you're eating, and it's still the calories that you're taking in. Because at the end of the day, if you're changing your diet and the things that you're eating, but you're not actually in any sort of calorie deficit, you're probably not going to lose any weight. But the reason why certain higher fat diets work for some people, and they bring off some of that weight, first and foremost, the weight that first comes off, a lot of it is water, because when we store glycogen in our liver, and so glycogen, when you eat carbohydrates, the extra glucose gets stored as glycogen in your liver. When you go on a low carb diet, that glycogen stores, or they're not full anymore because you're not eating that many carbohydrates. And the glycogen holds on to water in its storage. So you're actually, a lot of the water that comes off initially in lower carb diets, a lot of the weight that comes off is water. But the fat helps you feel full, which means you don't end up eating more. So that is usually why the lower carb, higher fat diet lead to some weight losses, because in the end of the day, you're probably actually eating fewer calories if you are feeling full really well from the fat. So anyway, thanks for sharing that.
Okay, we have one last question because it's 6:56 from Roy. Could you explain what someone who doesn't have type 1 what their blood glucose profile would look like compared to someone who does?
Sorry, someone who doesn't have type 1, what their blood glucose
Profile. What their
profile.
is like, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
So,
like throughout the day?
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I can share this because I personally worn the Dexcom G6 for fun before when they were releasing it. And you know, if you don't have, like, this is not no diabetes, no type 1 diabetes. When you're eating, yes, you will see the blood sugar go up. If you ate carbs, you will see the blood sugar spike, and then you'll see it come back down. And then in between the meals, typically, if you're not eating anything, you will see it quite flat. And this is what I noticed, like overnight, my blood sugar was like flat as a board, probably somewhere in the 5 range. And then, yeah, in between meals, and I noticed it eating like my Chinese family meals with the white rice. I think I peaked in somewhere like 10. It wasn't an hour after, it wasn't even 2 hours, but it was like probably 30, 45 minutes that it went to 10. That was scary. But it comes back down. So they just look like peaks and they come back down, and they're usually pretty flat in between. In terms of numbers, 4 to 6 between like the meal times, and you know, depending on what you eat, like even if you don't have diabetes, if you eat something that's really significantly high in refined carbs, you are still going to see a spike afterwards because your insulin's still working on bringing it down if you ate that many carbs. But in general, yeah, it's just something like that. Does that answer your question?
And the follow-up question was, what is the max blood glucose after a normal meal for someone who doesn't have type 1? And how fast would it return to baseline?
I don't know. I would expect after about 2 hours, you should be seeing it like 6 to 8. And then at least after the 3rd hour, somewhere back to the 4 to 6 range. But that is a hard one to define because if you don't have type 1, assuming you don't have type 2, and assuming you don't have any prediabetes or glucose intolerance, then, you know, your normal, no blood sugar problem person may have somewhere between 4 to 6 and then come back down to there around 3-4 hours. But that actually does also depend on the meal too, because we know that fat can prolong, even in like even if you don't have diabetes, fat takes a longer time for the blood sugar to rise, and it takes a longer time for it to fall back down. For example, when I ate my breakfast, that was 2 eggs, avocado, and a piece of sourdough that I made myself, it hardly went up, but it actually like kind of was this really flat, long thing, like really flat curve, and it was mostly flat. Then I ate rice and it was sky high, but it was mostly flat. It was a little bump from the bread, but yeah, it mostly stays like that and it'll come back down. So it's a hard question to actually answer.
All right, so it's almost 7 o'clock. It's 6:59. I want to thank you for taking an hour out of your time tonight to come to the huddle, answer questions. I'm going to clap, even though you can't hear me clapping, and I think you can see people clapping. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I hope you guys found this helpful at all. Okay.
Have a nice dinner. No rice.
Have a good night, everyone.